At 02:47 on the morning of February 22nd, 1943, Commander James Albert Hirschfield stood on the bridge of the United States Coast Guard, Cutter Campbell, watching a shadow in the North Atlantic, darkness 800 yards ahead. A German U-boat that had just torpedoed another Allied merchant ship, and he gave an order that violated everything the manual said about modern naval warfare. Full speed ahead. Ram her. The officers on the bridge exchanged glances. Ramming was a tactic from the age of sail, from wooden ships and iron men, from a time before torpedoes and deck guns could tear a vessel apart at range. The United States Navy's tactical doctrine classified ramming as obsolete, dangerous, a desperation move that risked destroying both vessels. The manual was explicit. Ramming should be considered only when all other options had failed, and even then, only with extreme caution. Hirschfield had depth charges. He had deck guns. He had every modern weapon the Coast Guard could provide. He chose the oldest weapon in naval history. The Campbell's twin screws bit into the freezing Atlantic water. Her Westinghouse turbines driving 6,200 horsepower through two shafts, accelerating the 327-foot cutter toward a collision that would either sink the U-boat or send both vessels to the bottom. James Albert Hirschfield was 40 years old. Born July 30th, 1902 in Cincinnati, Ohio. His father, Eli Albert Hirschfield, had worked as a tradesman, and young James had grown up understanding that results mattered more than regulations. The family moved to San Antonio, Texas, where Hirschfield graduated from Main Avenue High School, then spent 2 years at the University of Texas before deciding that classrooms weren't for him. In 1922, at 20 years old, he entered the United States Coast Guard Academy as a cadet. He graduated on October 27, 1924, and began a career that would take him from destroyer duty to the frozen waters where German submarines hunted Allied convoys like wolves circling sheep. By 1943, Hirschfield had served aboard the destroyers USS Cummins, Henley, Wilkes, and Downs. He understood ship handling the way a surgeon understands anatomy. Every vibration of the deck told him what his vessel was doing. Every shudder of the hull told him what she could take. When he took command of the Campbell, he inherited a ship that the Coast Guard called the Queen of the Seas, built at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, laid down May 1st, 1935, launched June 3rd, 1936, commissioned June 16th, 1936. The Campbell was one of 7 Treasury-class cutters, 327 feet of American steel designed to chase rum runners and rescue sailors. Nobody had designed her to fight U-boats, but in the winter of 1942 into 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was killing Allied sailors at a rate that threatened to starve Britain into submission. German Admiral Karl Dönitz had deployed his submarine wolf packs across the convoy routes, and the U-boats were winning. The statistics were brutal. In January 1943 alone, German submarines sank 37 Allied ships totaling 203,000 tons. The previous month had been worse. 60 ships lost. The month before that, 119 ships sent to the bottom. Allied merchant sailors were dying faster than shipyards could build replacements, and the cargo those sailors carried, fuel, food, ammunition, tanks, aircraft, was piling up in American ports while Britain's stockpiles dwindled. The Treasury-class cutters were never meant for this war. Their 5-inch deck guns, their depth charge racks, their sonar equipment, all of it had been added after the shooting started. They were too slow to chase a surfaced U-boat, too lightly armed to fight one on even terms, and too valuable as convoy escorts to risk in aggressive tactics. The doctrine was clear. Locate the submarine with sonar, attack with depth charges, force the U-boat to break off its attack on the convoy, then resume escort duty. Do not pursue, do not engage directly, do not ram. Commander Morrison, a senior officer who had reviewed convoy escort procedures, called ramming a relic of the previous century. Said any captain who tried it would lose his ship and probably his commission. The manual agreed. Depth charges existed precisely so that surface vessels didn't have to close to point-blank range with a submerged enemy. Hirschfeld read the manual. He filed it away, and on February 21st, 1943, when convoy on 166 sailed from Liverpool bound for North America, Commander James Hirschfeld took the Campbell to sea with a crew of approximately 125 men, and a personal conviction that doctrine was written by men who had never watched a U-boat sink a ship full of sailors. Convoy. On 166 was a westbound formation. 63 merchant ships carrying cargo that Britain no longer needed, empty holds and ballast heading back to American ports to reload. The convoy stretched across miles of ocean, columns of ships plodding through winter seas at the speed of the slowest vessel, approximately 8 knots, a pace that made them perfect targets for Dönitz's wolf packs. The escort force was international, British corvettes, the Polish destroyer Bursa, Canadian vessels, and the American Coast Guard cutters Campbell and Spencer. Commander Hirschfeld's Campbell served as one of the primary escort vessels, responsible for detecting and driving off any submarines that approached the convoy. The Germans knew the convoy was coming. By February 1943, the German Naval Intelligence Service had cracked enough Allied codes to track convoy movements. Dönitz positioned 2 wolf packs, codenamed Ritter and Knappen, across the expected route. 21 U-boats formed a patrol line stretching hundreds of miles across the North Atlantic, waiting for On 166 to sail into their teeth. The first attacks came on February 21st. U-boats slipped through the escort screen in darkness, fired torpedoes into the convoy, and dove before the escorts could respond. The merchant ship Empire Trader took a torpedo and began to sink. Then the Stigstad, then the Empire Redshank. The escorts counterattacked with depth charges, forcing the U-boats down. But every time the surface ships turned to prosecute a submarine contact, another U-boat slipped in from a different direction. The convoy was bleeding ships, and the escorts couldn't stop the hemorrhage. By the early hours of February 22nd, On 166 had lost multiple vessels, and the U-boats showed no sign of breaking off. The Wolfpack tactics were working exactly as Dönitz had designed them: overwhelm the escorts with multiple simultaneous threats, force them to choose which submarines to chase, and torpedo the undefended merchant men. Commander Hirschfeld had spent the previous hours racing from contact to contact, dropping depth charges, firing star shells to illuminate the darkness, trying to drive the wolves away from his flock. His crew was exhausted. His depth charge supply was depleted, and the U-boats kept coming. At approximately 0200 on February 22nd, the Campbell's sonar operator reported a contact. Strong return, bearing 345. Range closing. Hirschfeld ordered the cutter to investigate. What happened next would change the Battle of the Atlantic. The contact was U-606, a Type 6C submarine under the command of Oberleutnant zur See Hans Döhler. At 24 years old, Döhler was a relatively inexperienced commander on his 4th war patrol with U-606. The submarine had been commissioned January 22, 1942, built by Blohm and Voss in Hamburg, yard number 582. Type 6C submarines were the workhorses of Dönitz's fleet. 769 tons surfaced, 871 tons submerged, 220 feet long. They carried 14 torpedoes, 4 bow tubes and 1 stern tube, plus an 88mm deck gun and a 20mm anti-aircraft cannon. Crew complement was approximately 44 men. U-606 had already attacked the convoy, and now she was on the surface. either recharging batteries or repositioning for another torpedo run. The darkness should have hidden her, but the Campbell's lookouts spotted the low silhouette against the slightly lighter horizon. Hirschfeld had a choice. He could illuminate the target with star shells, giving his gunners a clear shot, but also warning the U-boat to dive. A submerged submarine was nearly impossible to sink with the weapons available in 1943. Sonar was unreliable. Depth charges had to explode within 20 feet of the pressure hull to cause fatal damage. And a skilled submarine commander could evade for hours. He could close to depth charge range. But U-606 would hear the Campbell's propellers and crash dive long before the cutter arrived. Even at 20 knots, the Campbell needed several minutes to cover the distance. More than enough time for the submarine to disappear, or he could ram. The manual said ramming was obsolete. The manual said ramming would damage both vessels. The manual said ramming was suicide. Hirschfeld ordered flank speed. The Campbell's turbines screamed. The cutter heeled as she came around to an intercept course. At 20 knots, she was closing the distance at roughly 33 feet per second, and the U-boat's bridge watch had only seconds to react. U-606's lookouts spotted the charging cutter too late. Alarms shrieked through the submarine's hull. Men scrambled down the conning tower hatch. The diving officer ordered emergency descent, but the submarine was heavy with seawater in her ballast tanks, and she was slow to respond. The Campbell's bow struck U-606 just forward of the conning tower. The impact threw men off their feet throughout both vessels. The Campbell's reinforced bow, designed to push through North Atlantic ice, crushed into the submarine's pressure hull at a combined closing speed of approximately 25 knots. Metal screamed against metal. The U-boat's outer hull buckled and tore, but the collision geometry was not what Hirschfeld had hoped for. Instead of riding up and over the submarine, driving her down with the cutter's weight, the Campbell struck at an angle that raked along the U-boat's hull. The submarine's conning tower caught the cutter's bow and twisted it sideways. The impact tore a gash in the Campbell's hull below the waterline, approximately 15 feet long, opening her forward compartments to the freezing Atlantic. U-606 was mortally wounded, but she didn't die immediately. The submarine's hull had been breached in multiple locations. Flooding was catastrophic, but her diesels were still running and her crew was still fighting. German sailors poured onto the deck, manning the anti-aircraft gun, firing into the darkness at the cutter that had just tried to destroy them. The Campbell's gun crews responded instantly. On the cutter's deck, an 11-man gun crew, all African-American sailors serving in a segregated navy, opened fire with the aft 3-inch gun. In the darkness and chaos of the collision aftermath, with their own ship taking water and listing, these men poured shells into the stricken submarine at point-blank range. The engagement lasted approximately 11 minutes. At 03:08, U-606's resistance ended. The submarine was sinking, her hull ruptured in multiple places, water pouring into compartments faster than her pumps could handle. German sailors began abandoning ship, jumping into the freezing Atlantic, swimming toward the cutter that had killed their boat. Hirschfeld faced another decision. The Campbell was badly damaged. The 15-foot gash in her hull was flooding her forward spaces. Her bow was twisted. She was listing and losing buoyancy. Protocol said she should withdraw from the convoy, head for the nearest port, save herself. But there were German sailors in the water, men who would die of hypothermia in minutes if no one rescued them. And there were other U-boats still stalking the convoy. Hirschfeld ordered his crew to rescue the survivors, the Campbell's sailors, many of them working in freezing spray on a listing deck, pulled German submariners from the water, one by one. Some of the Germans were wounded. Some were in shock. Some fought against their rescuers before hypothermia stole their strength. The cutter rescued approximately 20 survivors from U-606's crew of 44. The rest, including Commander Dohler, went down with their boat or died in the water before they could be reached. U-606 sank at position 47 degrees 44 minutes north, 33 degrees 43 minutes west. The submarine that had helped Savage convoy on 166 was gone, but the Campbell's fight was just beginning. The damage assessment was worse than anyone had feared. The collision had torn the cutter's bow. The 15-foot gash extended below the waterline, flooding the forward compartments. The Campbell's damage control teams worked desperately to shore up bulkheads and pump out water, but the Atlantic kept pouring in. The temperature of the seawater was approximately 34 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill an unprotected man in minutes, and it was filling the ship's forward spaces at a rate that threatened to drag her under. The Campbell was approximately 800 miles from the nearest Allied port, St. John's, Newfoundland. At her current rate of flooding, she might not survive the day. Hirschfeld did the math. If the ship sank, he would lose approximately 125 American sailors plus the German prisoners. The convoy would lose one of its primary escorts, and the U-boats would claim another victim. If he could keep the ship afloat, even barely, he might save everyone. The commander who had violated doctrine by ramming now violated it again by refusing to abandon ship. He ordered all non-essential personnel to prepare for possible evacuation. He redistributed weight throughout the vessel, moving ammunition, fuel, stores, anything that could shift the ship's center of gravity away from the flooded bow. He organized continuous damage control watches, men working in shifts to pump water and reinforce failing bulkheads. The Polish destroyer Burza, which had participated in the attack on U-606 by dropping additional depth charges, stood by to assist. Her commander offered to take off the Campbell's crew. Hirschfeld declined. The Campbell would make port under her own power, or she would sink trying. The convoy couldn't wait. On 166 continued west, protected by its remaining escorts, leaving the crippled Campbell behind. The cutter was now alone in waters still infested with German submarines, unable to maneuver effectively, unable to fight, barely able to stay afloat. For 11 days, the Campbell crawled toward Newfoundland. 11 days of continuous pumping. 11 days of bulkheads groaning under pressure they were never designed to bear. 11 days of sailors working 4-hour watches in freezing spray, then collapsing into wet bunks for 4 hours of exhausted sleep, then returning to the pumps. The first day was the worst. The flooding seemed unstoppable. Every time the damage control teams shored up one leak, another opened. The ship's bow rode lower and lower in the water, until waves were breaking over the forward deck even in moderate seas. Chief Boatswain's Mate Oscar Murray, one of the Campbell's senior enlisted men, organized the damage control efforts with a precision that bordered on the mechanical. Bulkheads were reinforced with timber from the ship's emergency stores. Mattresses were stuffed into gaps too small for proper shoring. When the mattresses proved insufficient, sailors stripped off their own clothing to plug holes in their ship. The Campbell's engine room crew kept the turbines running despite saltwater contamination in the fuel lines. Machinists mate first class. Raymond Cowart, who would later receive the Navy Cross for his actions, worked 48 hours straight to keep the propulsion systems operational. Without power, the pumps would fail, and without the pumps, the ship would sink. By the second day, the flooding had been contained. The Campbell wasn't saved, but she wasn't sinking anymore. She had reached a precarious equilibrium, water coming in at roughly the same rate the pumps were pushing it out. Hirschfeld calculated their speed of advance, approximately 4 knots, barely faster than a man could walk. At that rate, they would reach St. John's in approximately 8 days, if nothing else went wrong. On the third day, the weather deteriorated. North Atlantic winter storms are measured in terms of wave height and wind speed, and by both measures, the storm that struck the Campbell was severe. Waves reached heights of 30 to 40 feet. Winds exceeded 50 knots. The damaged cutter, already struggling to stay afloat, was now fighting the sea itself. The motion of the ship in heavy seas put tremendous stress on the damaged bulkheads. Every wave that struck the bow drove water into the flooded compartments. Every roll of the ship shifted the weight of thousands of gallons of trapped seawater. The groaning of overstressed metal became a constant background noise, punctuated by occasional sounds that made even veteran sailors freeze. The crack of a support giving way, the rush of water finding a new path into the ship. Hirschfeld reduced speed to 2 knots, barely enough to maintain steerage. Any faster, and the waves would tear the bow apart. The crew worked through the storm in conditions that would have been dangerous on a healthy ship. On the Campbell, men tied themselves to deck fixtures to avoid being washed overboard, then used their free hands to pump and patch and pray. 3 sailors were injured during the storm, broken bones from falls, lacerations from flying debris. The ship's medical officer treated them in a sick bay that was itself taking water, setting fractures on a deck that pitched 40 degrees with every swell. The storm lasted 36 hours. When it passed, the Campbell was still afloat. On the 5th day, a Canadian corvette found them. HMCS Dauphin had been dispatched from St. John's when the Campbell reported her condition. The corvette's commander offered to take off the crew or to attempt a tow. Towing a 327-foot cutter through the North Atlantic in winter is not a standard operation. The tow lines would be under enormous stress, and a failure could send both ships into a collision. In the Campbell, riding low and sluggish would be nearly impossible to control. Hirschfeld accepted the tow. The alternative was another 6 days of crawling toward port at 2 knots. 6 more days for something to go wrong. 6 more days of exhausting his crew. The connection took 4 hours. Lines parted twice in the rough seas before a secure tow was established. Once connected, the Dauphin began pulling the crippled cutter toward Newfoundland at approximately 6 knots, cutting the remaining transit time in half. The crew of the Campbell finally had time to rest, but Hirschfeld kept the watches going. He had seen too many damaged ships lost to complacency, survivors who thought they were safe, only to have a forgotten compartment flood or a weakened bulkhead fail. The Campbell would not join that list. On February 28th, 6 days after ramming U-606, the crew spotted the coast of Newfoundland. On March 1st, the Campbell was towed into Argentia Harbor. On March 5th, approximately 11 days after the collision, the cutter finally reached the repair facilities at St. John's. Every member of her crew had survived. All German prisoners had been delivered safely ashore, and the manual that called ramming suicide was proven wrong. The immediate aftermath was complicated. Hirschfeld's decision to ram had destroyed a German submarine, but it had also put his ship out of action for months. The Campbell would require extensive repairs, new bow plating, rebuilt internal compartments, replacement of flooded equipment. In a war where every escort vessel was desperately needed, losing one for repairs was a significant cost. Some officers questioned the wisdom of the ramming attack. Lieutenant Commander Morrison, reviewing the action report, noted that depth charges might have achieved the same result without damaging the cutter. Captain Heinemann, commanding the escort group, praised Hirschfeld's aggressiveness, but wondered if the price had been too high. The enlisted men had no such doubts. Word spread through the convoy escort community within days. A Coast Guard commander had rammed a U-boat at full speed, had Tom open his own ship doing it, and had then kept that ship afloat for 11 days through sheer determination. The story grew in the telling, as war stories do. But the core facts needed no embellishment. The Campbell's crew became celebrities of a sort. When they came ashore in St. John's, they found that their reputation had preceded them. Other sailors bought them drinks, Officers who had never met them shook their hands. The men who had pumped and patched and prayed their way across 800 miles of hostile ocean were heroes. The German prisoners told a different story. Interrogation reports from the survivors of U-606 revealed the confusion and terror of the final minutes. The U-boat's bridge watch had spotted the charging cutter too late to dive effectively. The impact had killed several men instantly. The flooding had been catastrophic and immediate. Most of the crew had been trapped below decks when the submarine went down. The survivors described a ship that had appeared out of the darkness like an avenging ghost. A ship that had done something U-boat commanders thought impossible. A ship that had chosen violence over doctrine and won. The interrogation reports went up the chain of command. Allied intelligence officers noted that U-boat crews were reporting increased concern about aggressive convoy escorts. The psychological impact of the ramming. The knowledge that Allied captains might sacrifice their own ships to destroy a submarine added a new fear to the already terrifying calculus of submarine warfare. Convoy. Un-166 reached North America with significant losses. The U-boat wolf packs had sunk 14 merchant ships during the running battle, approximately 22% of the convoy. Over 300 merchant sailors died in the Arbide attacks. It was one of the costliest convoy battles of the war to that date, but the German submarines had also suffered. U-606 was confirmed, sunk by the Campbell's ramming attack and depth charges from the Burza. At least one other U-boat had been damaged during the convoy battle, and the aggressive tactics of the escorts, including Hirschfeld's ramming, had prevented what could have been a complete massacre. The statistical analysis took weeks to compile. Before aggressive tactics became common, convoy escort vessels had sunk an average of 1 U-boat for every 12 merchant ships lost. The escorts were trading at a rate that favored the Germans. During convoy on 166, the ratio had improved to 1 U-boat sunk for every 14 ships lost. Not a victory, but a sign that something was changing. Over the following months, as other escort commanders adopted more aggressive approaches, the ratio continued to improve. By May 1943, Allied forces would sink 43 U-boats in a single month, a loss rate that forced Dönitz to withdraw his wolf packs from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The Battle of the Atlantic would continue until 1945. U-boats would sink ships until the last days of the war, but the tide had turned in the spring of 1943, and the aggressive tactics pioneered by commanders like Hirschfeld were part of the reason. The German perspective on the engagement came from multiple sources. Interrogation of the U-606 survivors provided tactical details about the submarine's final patrol. The crew had departed from the U-boat base at Saint-Nazaire, France, crossed the Bay of Biscay, and joined the Wolfpack formation, targeting convoy on 166. They had successfully attacked at least 1 merchant ship before the Campbell found them. The U-boat's war diary, reconstructed from survivor testimony, indicated that Oberleutnant Döhler had been attempting to reposition for another attack when the cutter was sighted. The submarine was on the surface to take advantage of her higher surface speed, approximately 17 knots compared to approximately 7 knots submerged, and to recharge batteries depleted by the previous day's operations. The survivors described the moment of impact as a sound like the end of the world. Metal screaming, the deck heaving beneath their feet, water exploding into compartments that had been dry seconds before, men thrown against machinery, bones breaking, screams cut short by the rising flood. Most of the engine room crew died at their stations. The flooding was too fast, the escape routes too narrow, the darkness too complete. Sailors who had survived years of depth charge attacks, who had learned to function under conditions that would have driven most men mad, found themselves drowning in compartments they couldn't escape. The 20 men who, reached the surface, did so through a combination of luck and proximity to the conning tower hatch. They swam in water so cold that hypothermia began within seconds, their muscles cramping, their thoughts becoming slow and confused, until American hands reached down to pull them aboard the ship that had just killed their boat. German naval intelligence analyzed the loss of U-606 in their regular assessment of submarine operations. The report noted that ramming attacks, while rare, were becoming more frequent as Allied escort commanders grew more aggressive. The report recommended that U-boat commanders maintain greater awareness of escort positions and be prepared to dive immediately upon visual contact. The recommendation was easier to make than to follow. In the darkness of a North Atlantic night, against an enemy willing to sacrifice his own ship, sometimes there was no time to dive. Commander James Hirschfield received the Navy Cross for his actions during the Battle of Convoy on 166. The citation praised his extraordinary heroism and outstanding devotion to duty, his decision to ram the enemy submarine, his 11-day struggle to save his ship and crew. It did not mention that his decision had violated established doctrine, or that senior officers had questioned his tactics, or that the manual still called ramming obsolete. The Navy Cross was the second highest award for valor in naval combat, outranked only by the Medal of Honor. Hirschfield wore it without comment. He never publicly criticized the officers who had questioned his decision, never pointed out that his obsolete tactic had worked when modern methods might have failed. The Campbell underwent repairs at St. John's and later at the Boston Navy Yard. The work took months, replacing the crushed bow, rebuilding flooded compartments, testing and certifying every system that had been exposed to salt water. By the time she returned to service, the Battle of the Atlantic had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. Hirschfield continued to command the Campbell until 1944, then moved to other assignments as the war progressed. He served in various capacities throughout the conflict, accumulating experience and commendations, building a reputation as an officer who got results regardless of what the manual said. The war ended in 1945. James Hirschfield did not go home to a parade. He stayed in the Coast Guard, the service he had joined as a 20-year-old cadet, the service that had given him the Campbell and the chance to prove that courage could overcome doctrine. His post-war career was distinguished but quiet. He rose through the ranks, taking assignments that tested his skills and expanded his experience. By the early 1950s, he had achieved the rank of Rear Admiral, one of the most senior officers in the Coast Guard. In 1954, Hirschfield was appointed Assistant Commandant of the United States Coast Guard, the second highest position in the service. He served in that role until 1962, overseeing operations that ranged from search and rescue to law enforcement to icebreaking. He never commanded another ship in combat. The Campbell, the cutter he had nearly destroyed to sink a submarine, continued in service until 1982. She served as a weather patrol vessel, as a search and rescue platform, as a training ship for new Coast Guard officers. Her bow bore the scars of repairs made in 1943, visible reminders of the night she had been driven into a German submarine at full speed. In 1984, 2 years after decommissioning, the Campbell was sunk as a target ship during a naval exercise. She went down off the coast of Hawaii at coordinates 22 degrees 48 minutes north, 160 degrees 6 minutes west, approximately 8,000 miles from where she had rammed U-606. The Queen of the Seas, the ship that had refused to sink, finally found her rest. James Albert Hirschfield retired from the Coast Guard in 1962 after 38 years of service. He had entered as a cadet and left as a vice admiral, one of the most decorated officers in Coast Guard history. He settled in Rancho Santa Fe, California, a quiet community north of San Diego, His wife, Marjorie Prentice Hirschfield, had supported him through decades of service, through the absences and the worries and the moments when she didn't know if her husband's ship would come home. They lived quietly. Hirschfield did not give interviews about the war. He did not write memoirs. He did not attend reunions or make speeches about the night he rammed a U-boat. When neighbors asked about his service, he said he had been in the Coast Guard and changed the subject. The men who had served with him remembered differently. Survivors of the Campbell's crew stayed in touch through the decades. They sent Christmas cards and birth announcements and eventually funeral notices. They told their children and grandchildren about the commander who had ordered a ramming attack when the manual said it was suicide, who had kept a sinking ship afloat through 11 days of North Atlantic winter, who had brought everyone home. Raymond Cowart, the machinist's mate who had kept the engines running, received his own Navy Cross for the voyage. He would later say that Hirschfield was the finest officer he ever served under, a man who asked nothing of his crew that he wouldn't do himself. Oscar Murray, the chief boatswain's mate who had organized the damage control efforts, served out the war and returned to civilian life. He rarely spoke about the Campbell. But when he did, his voice carried the weight of 11 days of fighting to keep a ship alive. The 11 African-American sailors who had manned the aft gun during the engagement, who had poured shells into U-606 while their own ship flooded beneath them, returned to a segregated America that gave them few opportunities to speak about their service. Their names appear in the records, but their individual stories have largely been lost. James Albert Hirschfield died on May 16, 1993, at the age of 90. He passed at his home in Rancho Santa Fe, surrounded by family, 50 years after the night he had driven the Campbell into a German submarine. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his service in the Coast Guard, his rank of Vice Admiral, his role as Assistant Commandant. It did not mention U-606. It did not mention the 15-foot gash in the Campbell's hull. It did not mention 11 days of pumping and patching and refusing to surrender to the sea. Those details appeared in the military records, in the files preserved by the Coast Guard Historian's Office, in the interrogation reports from German prisoners, and the after-action analyses from convoy commanders. They were facts, verified and documented. But they weren't the kind of facts that made it into obituaries. Hirschfield was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, Section 64, grave 1967. His headstone lists his rank, his dates of service, his wars. It does not mention that he violated doctrine to sink a U-boat, or that he kept a dying ship alive through sheer will, or that he proved the manual wrong. The manual has since been revised. Modern naval doctrine acknowledges that ramming may be appropriate in certain circumstances, when other weapons have failed, when the enemy cannot be allowed to escape, when the stakes justify the risk. The tactic that Commander Morrison called obsolete, that the regulations called suicide, is now recognized as a valid option in extremis. The change didn't credit Hirschfield specifically. It credited engineering analysis and operational experience, the same bureaucratic language that always absorbs individual courage into institutional knowledge. But the men who served on convoy escorts in 1943 knew who had proven the point. The USCGC Ingham, one of the Campbell's sister ships, survives today as a museum ship in Key West, Florida. Visitors can walk her decks, can see the depth charge racks and the 5-inch guns, can imagine what it was like to hunt U-boats in the North Atlantic winter. The Coast Guard Museum in New London, Connecticut, preserves artifacts and records from the Treasury-class cutters. Historians can access files detailing the Campbell's service, including the action reports from February 1943. The U-boat archive, maintained by researchers who have dedicated decades to preserving the records of German submarine operations, contains the interrogation reports from U-606 survivors. The documents include descriptions of the ramming, the flooding, the desperate final minutes of a submarine's life. Naval history courses at the Coast Guard Academy mention the Campbell and Hirschfield as examples of aggressive anti-submarine warfare. Cadets learn that doctrine provides guidelines, but that commanders must sometimes exceed those guidelines when circumstances demand. The lesson is taught without drama. It appears in textbooks between discussions of sonar technology and depth charge patterns. One more tactical option in a curriculum full of tactical options. But somewhere in the record, in the Navy Cross citation and the damage control reports and the survivor interviews, is the truth that no textbook can capture. At 0247 on February 22, 1943, a Coast Guard commander made a decision that the manual called suicide. He drove his ship into a German submarine at full speed. He tore a 15-foot hole in his own hull, and then he spent 11 days proving that the manual was wrong. That courage and will and seamanship could overcome damage that should have been fatal. That a ship doesn't sink until her crew decides to let her. The Campbells survived because James Hirschfield refused to accept any other outcome. U-606 sank because he refused to accept any other outcome. The manual said ramming was obsolete. The bottom of the Atlantic, where U-606 still rests, says otherwise.